Providence Missionary Church family. So glad to see you back with us tonight. We're going to be in Esther chapter 5. So if you want to turn in your Bibles there to Esther chapter 5, that's where we'll be. As you're turning there, I'd like to review a little bit from what we covered this morning. We were in Esther chapter 4. In this chapter, we learned that the lives of all the Jews who were living in Persia were threatened by Haman the Agagite. Her cousin, Esther's cousin Mordecai, told her to go before the king to plead for the lives of the Jewish people. But Esther was scared to do so before the king without being summoned. It was something that the queen just didn't have access to the king. She had to be summoned by him, and she had not been summoned by him for nearly 30 days by this point. So he might put her to death if she were to do so. But Mordecai tells her and reminds her that she's going to die anyway. The secret had already been out, and that if she doesn't go before the king, that they're going to die and she's going to die anyway. So she needs to go ahead and do it, accept this challenge that he's laid in front of her. Her only chance is to go before the king. He also reminds her that the position that she's been given. He said, basically he's saying, is it any coincidence that you have this? God has placed you in this position. You need to follow through and do what God has placed you in this position to do, or God will find someone else to do it. So that's the scenario we're in. And then, of course, one of the most important things that I saw and touched on within the chapter is that Esther asked everyone to pray for her, to fervently pray for the situation, and accepts the challenge. Now, here are the things that she's going to have to do, that she's been challenged by Mordecai to do. She's going to have to speak to the king, and remember, she has to break a law in order to do that. She has to be summoned in to see the king in order for her to be able to speak to him. She has to make her appeal to the king, and in doing so, that makes the confession that she is a Jew and that she's deceived the king by not telling him he was a Jew. She must attempt to have the king reverse this irreversible law, as laws were in the Persian Empire. She also must oppose Haman, who by this point in time within our text has become increasingly powerful. So she has to oppose him. She also must pursue a plan which will strike a serious blow to the king's pride. If you remember earlier on within the first few chapters, actually chapter 1, we saw how well that went for his first wife. So those are all things that she's dealing with. Now let's look and see, that's a very quick rundown of what we covered this morning. Let's look at chapter 5 and read verse 1. If you'll turn Esther chapter 5 verse 1. Let's look at this together. It says, "Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house." So she goes on the third day. She has at this point in time, the people and she have completed the prayer and fasting, and she wastes no time going in before this Persian king. Now we see here that she puts on her royal clothes. That's what it says here in our text in verse 1. Can you imagine the agony that she's facing, trying to make the decision of what to wear, how to do this, what to say? It's just hard to imagine. But as I looked at this, this is going to be getting off of a serious note. As I was studying this for myself, I see that things haven't changed too much over a 2500 period, has it? When women want to change their husbands' minds, they get all dolled up, and the men become putty in their hands. I'm on to you ladies. The secret is out of the bag. But notice she does not go before the king in sackcloth and ashes, and there's a reason for that. Remember, we discussed why the Jews would wear that type of clothing. Normally, made out of goat hair. They would do this in a sense of mourning, but she didn't do this. This would have caused her to be in a great deal of trouble, because you were not to go in mourning in the king's presence. That was just not tolerated. So once she is dressed in a desirable way, she goes before the king. Now again, can you imagine how scary this is for Esther, knowing that she can be killed? Let's be reminded that when we do what's right in the sight of the Lord, we will likely be put in situations that are not ideal, and that's exactly the type of situation that Esther is in here. I would even go even farther and say that the situations that we will be placed in are scary and uncomfortable. Let's look at verse 2, chapter 5 of Esther. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Remember what we said this morning? Esther had not seen him in 30 days. She didn't know what to expect. She had no idea. She hadn't, when you're not in close fellowship with people, you don't know what to expect. And she certainly hasn't been in close fellowship with her husband. And also, she's broken the law in what she's doing here. She was not summoned. So she's in a scary situation here. However, the king sees her standing there, and it pleases him. This has probably offered Esther a sense of security and a sense of boldness. I don't know about you, but for me, the hardest part of dealing with confrontational matters is just trying to start those conversations, the beginnings of them. And so she's kind of already dealt with the hardest part, in my opinion. Let's look at chapter 5, verse 3 together now. It says, Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given it shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. See, the king realizes what Esther's done. She's taken a great risk in what she's done. He would have certainly known this. And he also realizes that if she was willing to do this, she must have something very, very important on her mind. The king's offer is to give her half of the kingdom. Now I want to make sure we don't misunderstand this. This doesn't mean that she will literally own half of the kingdom. That's not what that means. This was a saying that kings would often use that would display his power and that he could greatly bless her. But it does not mean that she would literally own half of the kingdom. It's basically like saying, you can have anything you want. I'm the king. This has gotten kings in trouble in the past. If you'll remember, in the New Testament, King Herod got in trouble when his daughter received this offer and asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. We're familiar with that biblical text. So Esther went before the king to plead for the Jewish people, and the king says, you can have anything you want. You can have half of the kingdom. And I know what you're thinking. In our fleshly, secular minds, we're probably thinking, of course, many of you probably already know the story of Esther, but if you were reading this for the first time, you're probably thinking she's going to ask for the head of Haman on a platter, just as Herod's daughter asked for the head of John the Baptist. Well, let's go ahead and let's look at verse 4, and let's see what she asked for as she has this opportunity to talk to her husband, the king. Verse 4, And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into the banquet that I have prepared for him. Now, some of you may be seeing this and thinking, she's missed her opportunity here. She is to go in and she is to speak to the king, and she is to take the request of Mordecai, who's spoken to her earlier, and that's what she's supposed to do. But she asked him to come according to verse 4, this banquet. Why has she done this? He said, She could have anything. He was pleased with her. Why didn't she just ask for the head of Haman? In this culture, we talk about cultural discrepancies a lot, how we live in a Western culture. The Bible was written in an Eastern culture. In this culture, it is very insulting to get immediately to the heart of any matter. Things were dealt with many times in an indirect manner. And, you know, this can be a challenge for leadership today, even in our culture, even though some of us are different how we lead. But sometimes we would like to come in as leaders. Some of you may be leaders in your jobs and leaders in your homes, leaders on your athletic teams. And sometimes you'd like to come in and clean house with the problems we face. However, that type of methodology is not always very effective, not the best measures to take. So that's kind of what Esther is doing here. She knows that it would be rude of her to do what she would like to do, probably, or what many of us would have liked to done in her situation, if she just comes right out and asks for that and invites the king to do this to Haman. So what she does is she invites the king and Haman to a banquet, to a meal. She operates within proper protocol and etiquette. The king likely knows that this meal is not the real reason that Esther has risked her life to come into his presence. He knows more, there is more that's to come. He knows that this has something more to do than with her just wanting to cook a meal for him and Haman. Let's look at verses 5 and 6. Then the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet, and Esther had prepared. Verse 6, and the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Now this banquet's probably not what you're thinking. When you think of a banquet, in our minds we have this perception of this spread of food and gold goblets all over the place. That's not what we're dealing with here. It was more like a reception. It was likely a banquet of desserts and wine. Esther wanted the setting to be just right as she presented to the king her request. Now again, the king knew Esther didn't risk her life just to have this event to be put on, and now his curiosity is getting the best of him, and he's asking the question, what's your request? What is it? So that's what we see there in verses 5 and 6. Let's look at verse 7 together. Verse 7 says, then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is. Okay, we're going to wrap things up right here, and we're going to look at what happens next Sunday. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. And again, just continue to be in prayer about what all is going on here at the church. And we'll pick up right here where we left off. Now, you didn't really think I was going to do that here, right? Many times people complain about how long the sermons go on. And I hope in this case you were yelling at the TV for me, hey, how could you stop right there? Because we're kind of at a place where we're at what's known in literature as a hook. We're at a hook here, and let's see what happens here in verse 8. It says, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. So we see here in verse 8, you're probably thinking, what? What? She really likes to stir curiosity, doesn't she? Why didn't she just ask? Why didn't she just bring her petitions unto the king? But she doesn't. Remember, Esther's examined the situation and accepted the challenge to confront this matter. She is confronting this matter with much prayer. That's what we have to remember when we read through this and we're questioning, why is she doing it this way? we must remember she's doing it this way because God is guiding her in this way. She's doing it in much prayer. We need to be careful about being critical just because someone doesn't do something the way we think that it ought to happen. And you're going to find out more about this as this text goes along. This is especially true if we know that a person is confronting a matter in much prayer, which we know that Esther certainly was. Let's look at verse 9 as we're working our way through the text here. Verse 9 says, Then went Haman forth that day, joyful and with glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Haman had just been honored above every other man in the kingdom, just prior to what we read right here. He was a part of a private banquet with the king and the queen. Just a tremendous honor. It says the very first of the verse that he's in high spirits, as he should be. He's feeling joyful. But I also want to point out that it's very likely that he's walking away from this banquet drunk. As he leaves the king's palace, he's on a mountaintop. He's on a mountaintop. He leaves the king's palace, and who does he see? Mordecai. What does that result in? It goes from him being on a mountaintop to instant anger. Instant anger. Everyone's bowing to Haman. As he walks through, he's been elevated to this position. He walks by people and they're bowing down to him, but not Mordecai. And what does that do? Instant anger. Instant. And just like that, Haman's day is ruined. Haman's day is ruined. He's filled with rage and indignation against Mordecai. Now, I want to point out that this is exactly what hatred and unforgiveness does to us. It eats us up. It robs us of our joy. It robs us of the goodness that we can experience in our lives if not for these things. Let's look at verses 10 and 11. It says, Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife, and Haman told them of the glory and of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. The most common way to heal an injured ego is to boast about yourselves, to elevate yourselves. The Bible tells us to allow God to elevate ourselves, that He will lift you up in due time. But we know that when people are living ungodly lives, they elevate themselves, and that's what we see Haman doing here. He's seething with anger, and he, in his mind, knows. It says that he saw Mordecai was angry, but didn't act in any way. At first, he probably would have liked to have had Mordecai killed at that point in time, but he doesn't. But in his mind, he's thinking Mordecai's day will come. Furthermore, he calls in his wife and his friends, and he's sitting around bragging to them about how great he is, about the accomplishments, about what he owns and what he's done. A person with Haman's pride is only happy when he can boast to others about himself. Could you imagine being in someone's house and all they do is sit around and talk about themselves? I'm sure some of you have probably experienced that, how much they've done, how many points they maybe have scored, how rich they are. It's always difficult to be around someone who only talks and cares about themselves. But in the case of these friends, they were in a position where they had to sit and listen to that, or they would have probably been killed. Let's look at verse 12. We're nearing the end of our chapter. Verse 12. Haman said, Moreover, yea, Esther, the queen, did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. In other words, if one banquet was not enough, I get to go to a second banquet. This is twice as good. Haman is really thinking highly of himself here as he is being in this position of prestige, as we continue to read with verse 13. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So he's sharing with his friends and with his wife the fact that he walked away from this banquet he's on high. He's just experienced something that that no one else could, but yet Mordecai ruined all of that. Now, I think there's a lesson that we can learn about this. I know there's a lesson. I want you to think about this for a moment. Think about the American dream. The American dream. The American dream is achieving success and wealth. But let me ask you this question. Does wealth and success bring happiness? We know the answer to that. It doesn't. Haman had all of that. He had all of that. Is he happy? No, he's not. He's obsessed with Mordecai. So again, a wonderful lesson for us there in verse 13. Now let's look at verse 14 for a second. It says, Then said Jerish his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. As we saw earlier in Esther, I believe it was back in chapter 2, the gallows were not what we think of them as. It's not something that we see in westerns on Gunsmoke or The Rifleman or anything like that, any of the movies. It was more like a spike of wood thrust vertically in the ground, which victims would have been impaled upon. This was how the first type of crucifixion was brought to be. I've shared with you a number of times that the Romans stole the idea of a crucifixion from the Persians during the Punic Wars. They took it, they perfected it to the point where we see Jesus get on the cross. But it started here. This was a starting point for that type of punishment. Mordecai was not going to die from any normal gallows. That's how deep the hatred ran from Haman unto Mordecai. This was going to be 50 cubits high. You know how high that is? That's 75 feet. 75 feet high. It wasn't enough for him to just see Mordecai dead. He was going to have to die in a certain form and fashion. He wanted all the Israelite people dead. All of them. It wasn't enough for him to just hang Mordecai on any gallows. It had to be gallows that were 75 foot in the air. And Haman would impale Mordecai on it before tomorrow's banquet with the king and the queen. This does sound like a movie, doesn't it? It would appear that Esther's delay is going to cost Mordecai his life. We go back earlier in the chapters as we were reading this, when we were talking about Esther, and we wonder, why don't you deal with this situation? And now we see this and we're like, she's blown it. She's blown her opportunity. Now Mordecai is going to die. It's going to cost him his life. But there's one thing we must remember, friends. God is in control. And when we look at the situation that we're currently in, it's easy to wonder, what's going to happen? Am I going to be okay? God is in control. And we're going to see that God actually wanted these gallows built. He wanted that. This all falls into His plan. Now, what is that plan? Now, we're not going to see it within this chapter. The text hasn't answered that question for us yet, but it will. It will. And again, I just want to remind all of us, God's in control. This can be some scary times, turning on the media, listening to the news, all these doomsday reports. But again, let me remind everyone, God is in control. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for that. I know you are as well. In closing, I'm going to ask families to do something a little different. I'm going to place some questions, some topics on the screen as this comes to a conclusion. And I'd like for y'all to take a few moments to just discuss these things. And I'm so thankful again for the honor and the privilege to be your pastor. And I hope this has helped you and equipped you and brought peace and comfort as God's Word normally does. But I'm continuing to pray for you. I know you're praying for me. Your prayers are felt. I'm very thankful for that. And I know the rest of our staff is as well. And again, thank you so much.